Hello, everyone. This is Chris Decker coming with another update of the employment situation in Nebraska and Omaha. Today was a pretty eventful day in terms of some data. We got a couple of key reports came out. Today's July 2nd. We got a first look at the U.S. employment numbers for the month of June. They're preliminary, so they could get revised, but we got some data for the United States now to work with as we hone in on what we think is going to happen here in June and July and so forth here in the state of Nebraska and the city of Omaha. We also got today the latest week's worth of unemployment claims data from the Nebraska Department of Labor and a picture of what the continuing unemployment situation looks like for the final week of June. So this data that came out today, upon looking at it and kind of seeing what the implications of the current situation are in light of this data, I thought it'd be worthwhile to not only talk a little bit about both the weekly claims forecast, but also about the monthly employment forecast that I currently have going um, for the month of June. And I do want to start talking more specifically about where I think things are going to go later in the summer, notably July. So let's take a look first at the the jobs numbers that came out for the United States today. Some really good news with respect to the report. We added about 4.8 million jobs in June. Relative to May, we had lost over close to 21 million jobs in April. So we got over the month of May and June some really good recoveries going on here. We got about 7.5 million jobs back nationwide. That will bode well for the state level data for the month of June. That will come out in 2 weeks from today. About the middle of July, we'll get our first look at the June estimates for Nebraska and for Omaha. But this is really good news. And there were a number of sectors which really benefited. Again, I think a lot of it is the phased reopening that we saw most of the month of June in a lot of different states. I think that boded well for not only adding jobs but bringing the unemployment rate down to I think a little over 11%. We were at 16 plus percent not too long ago, so we're currently heading in the right direction in terms of jobs in our economy as a nation. Now, in terms of the weekly first-time unemployment claims data, last time I had done a recording was a couple of weeks ago on this data. And last week, my model performed frightfully well. In fact, almost to a spooky extent in the third week of June, that week ending about June 22nd. I had forecast about 4,307 new claims, and the number came in at 4,340, so I was off by 33. And for Douglas, Sarpy, and Washington counties, which comprise the Nebraska side of the city of Omaha, I had forecast 1772. We came in at 1781. So those were pretty close. Now, the last week here worth of data for weekly unemployment claims, my model is much more optimistic than what the data actually showed. I had forecast a little over 4,000 as a continuing trend downward. We had a bit of a bounce back up for this last week. We were at 4,578 according to the latest figures from the Nebraska Department of Labor. So I was off by about 539 or so. Not a huge miss, but certainly bigger than what my model has been able to produce recently. So while I do think that latest data point, the 4578, is not indicative of an upward trend, I do think there's some information in that as we head into July. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that in a few moments. Looking at Omaha, the model for Omaha still performed very well. I had forecast 1,678 new claims. We came in at 1,666 for Douglas, Sarpy, and Washington counties, so I was off by 12. Not too bad for Omaha for sure. Looks like most of the claims for unemployment came outside of the Omaha area. So again, we're going to be watching that very, very closely. Next couple of weeks, I will certainly continue to look at those numbers and see what some implications might be. In terms of continuing weeks claimed for unemployment, again, as this figure illustrates, we still have a downward trend, but the last week's worth of data did tick up from 55,000 to 56,219. Might be the case that some folks are finding it harder to find work and we're needing to continue on with their unemployment. So that uptick, again, I don't think that's going to be the first observation in an upward trend. Perhaps more just a setback short term, but I do think there's some information in that last week's worth of data for June, which are going to have some serious implications in my judgment for July. I really am quite positive now that the June numbers for Nebraska and Omaha are going to look quite good. And why don't we go ahead then and talk about where I'm now currently seeing the June numbers lying. I think June's still going to look good despite the last week's worth of data we had on weekly claims and continuing claims, largely because the national numbers looked very good, perhaps better than I had expected. We added quite a few jobs back nationwide in June, according to the BLS report that came out today. That usually bodes pretty well for the state of Nebraska. Some of the work that I've done have suggested that when the national job growth, when national jobs increase by, let's say 10%, we'll see about a 2.5% increase in our own jobs here for that same month. So there's a good positive correlation between how well the nation does and how well the state of Nebraska does. Now, it's not a perfect correlation because there are a lot of unique elements about Nebraska when compared to the nation as a whole. But there is that positive correlation. So when the national numbers come in pretty strong, that usually will imply a very good report for the state of Nebraska. And with that additional information, I've decided to revise upwards my June forecast. Now, again, the reason I can do that is because there's a 2-week delay in the state and city level numbers when compared to the national numbers. We had the national numbers today, and like I said, we got to wait 2 weeks to see what the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports for job growth here in the state of Nebraska. But I had been forecasting about 6,000 added jobs relative to May for the state of Nebraska. I think given the strong national report and the very good first 3 weeks of weekly claims data and continuing claims data for the state of Nebraska, those pieces of information combined, I'm suggesting we could see as many as 9,000 jobs coming back in June relative to May. So I think we could end up with about 962,000 jobs when all is said and done when we take a look at the June figures that we'll see in a couple of weeks. Similarly, I've revised upwards my forecast for Omaha. I previously thought we would add about 3,300 jobs. I think we could get a little bit more out of that. Again, there's a good correlation between how well the city of Omaha does and the nation as a whole. So I'm thinking a little under 4,000 jobs is a reasonable forecast for June. Now, again, a lot of data is already in, and it's just a matter of getting a look at what the figures will ultimately be when they're released to the public in 2 weeks. I think it's July 17th. So I will definitely be back to talk about the actual June numbers when we see them, and probably revise my overall long-term employment forecast then. But since we're here talking about June, and given that it is the 2nd of July, let's talk a little bit about what some of this most recent data might be suggesting about July. Well, I'm becoming increasingly concerned that July may not look as good as the last 2 months seem to be looking for the state of Nebraska and probably for the nation as a whole. Last couple of weeks, we have heard reports and we've seen the numbers. There are some serious and significant COVID-19 outbreaks in a number of states, mostly in southern states, but Texas and Florida, California, Arizona. We're seeing in Louisiana, Oklahoma. There are a lot of states which are experiencing some spikes. Likely the culprit for this is that these states may have misread the declines in COVID cases, and perhaps due to that observation and maybe even some political pressure, we might as well be adults about it, uh, instituted a far too rapid phased reopening for business activity. And I think that's generating some real concerns. Well, whether that's true or not, I can't verify. I think that's the case. What we do know is that some of these states are starting to reconsider and certainly slow down their reopening plans. Florida, for example, and California, for example, not allowing patrons to um, consume alcohol on site at bars and restaurants and so on. And a lot of states are now seriously considering, much stronger than they have before, but even mandating the wearing of masks. And I think that if these states get a handle on this outbreak and start bringing the numbers back down, that will bode well for the nation as a whole. But I think the next couple of weeks are going to be tough because we can't just see those COVID outbreaks bend down immediately. There's going to be some unfortunate retrenchment in our strategy for reopening, at least for a number of states in the nation. Now, in Nebraska, I don't want to say that the trend in new cases has been as uh, downward sloping as I wish it were. I've been watching those numbers, and we seem to be holding steady at best. There were some evidence earlier of some reasonable declines in COVID cases, certainly in Douglas County and in the state of Nebraska. But the last couple of days have defied that trend. So I don't think we're yet experiencing any kind of outbreak here in the state, and I think we should all take steps to keep it that way. We do have things under control, but that doesn't mean that we're out of the risk category for our economy. A lot of Nebraska companies are going to be doing business with firms in other states. And as a result of those other states needing to decelerate their business reopening strategies, that could slow down business activity for a lot of Nebraska firms. And we could see some slowdown in revenues. That could then delay Nebraska firms and Omaha firms and their rehiring plans. It could result in some refurloughing of some workers. So basically, the way I see July is what I hope to be a temporary setback, minor setback, it is my belief, for the recovery. I don't think it will derail the recovery. The only way the recovery gets derailed is if both other states as well as Nebraska and residents decide that they don't want to do anything to control COVID outbreaks. Under those circumstances, then quite honestly, I think we will see a resurgence of some of the bad news that we saw back in March and April. I really don't think we're going to get there, but I do think that we could have some retrenchment in July. So I have revised some of my weekly forecasts for some of the weeks in July, and I'll show you what I mean by that here very shortly. Um, for example, I had been forecasting a steady downward sloping trend in new claims in the state of Nebraska and for the city of Omaha. That gray line that you can see in the figure to the right was my old forecast. You can kind of see how, honestly, the forecast has tracked very well history. That last uptick for the latest week of data that we have, you can kind of see that little blue uptick right around the end of June, that 4,578. Again, if you look at it from graphical representation, doesn't look that bad, but certainly it is above what I had forecast. Now, Pay more attention, though, if you would, to how I have decided to modify, particularly the first couple of weeks of July. Um, I'm thinking that we may see some uptick here, and I decided, based on what the most recent weekly data was suggesting and what seems to be going on in terms of COVID outbreaks in other states, to offer a bit of perhaps a minor looking, but nonetheless an uptick in COVID cases, at least for part of July. And by the end of July, if other states get a handle on their COVID outbreaks, and we continue to work diligently towards suppressing our COVID outbreaks here in the state of Nebraska and in the city of Omaha, I think we'll be back down to my original forecast trend by the end of July. So my current thinking is we've got a minor setback in July. So perhaps the way things are looking right now, I'm going to slow my July forecast down. So just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, this slide here shows what I had for a previous forecast for both June and July for the state of Nebraska and for the city of Omaha. If you focus attention on that last line, that July line, I had been thinking we get about a 6% increase in jobs in July for the state of Nebraska. I actually think we might come in maybe a little bit under the June figure, maybe about even with the June figure. That's kind of the slowdown I'm anticipating right now. Again, I think it's a short-term blip in a recovery, and I don't think the long term is in any danger of not recovering. But I do think July might be a little bit more difficult a month than May and June have been in terms of job recovery in the state of Nebraska. Similarly, for the city of Omaha, I had been thinking about a 5.5% or so increase. I'm sorry, a 5.6 change in employment. That's what, 5,600 jobs rather. I kind of think we're going to again hold even relative to the June numbers in July. Now we're going to track what happens in the job claims data going forward. If job claims or initial unemployment claims fall dramatically, then I may come back and revise the July forecast. But we're kind of in a situation right now, both nationally and regionally, which suggests that the new COVID outbreak that we're seeing could have some adverse effects on economic recovery. Again, if we can get around that in some way, we can avoid that here in the state, then it's quite possible that July could still be a growth month. But the way things are looking right now, and based on the most recent data, I'm hesitant to call for that. I think what we're going to see at best is an even relatively flat growth look for July relative to June. In terms of the long term, it might be a little bit too early to tell. I haven't gone into my long-term model yet to simulate because I want to wait till I actually get a June number in order to resimulate to see if my long-term forecasts are going to change. The sense I'm getting based on what I'm seeing now is that the full recovery to pre-COVID levels of employment, I had been thinking by the middle or the latter part of next summer, where we would be back to levels of employment that we were in February and January of this year. This delay in July could have implications for how many jobs we can get back in August and September. If we do have a second wave that's difficult for the economy to manage, that could then delay the full recovery. My thinking now is that we'll be into the fall before we can get back to pre-COVID-19 levels of employment. We'll see. Again, we're going to be tracking some weekly data to see if this comes to fruition. I know I close about every one of my recordings with this statement, but I firmly believe it. All of this data aside, our best bet as a state and a city is still to do what we can do as citizens to control the spread of the contagion. Social distancing, wearing face masks is requested or encouraged or may even be required, who knows, but certainly right now in the state of Nebraska, it's not a requirement, but it's certainly smart. And if we do that, I think we will continue to be one of those states that is not experiencing an acceleration in cases. We've done remarkably well for a state that never truly shut down completely. We've managed to control the outbreak reasonably well. It would be nice to see some real downward trends on new COVID cases for the state and for the city. I don't think we're quite there yet. We're holding steady, which is not bad news, but I still think we can get this first wave down low enough where a second wave won't hurt us as much. Um, and again, the more you can bolster consumer confidence, the more we can bolster economic certainty. I think the better off our businesses will be, and the better off our job position will be in this state. So with that, I will close out this particular video, and we'll be coming back in a couple of weeks with some more employment information and some more weekly data information, and see if any updates to projections are necessary then. Thank you for your time.